When somebody asks, where should I start? The answer is often, start at the beginning. That's a flippant answer, and it's common advice given to writers when they need help starting their project. But it's good advice for any undertaking, because getting too deep too quickly forces you to have answers to questions that don't necessarily matter yet. This video is for new game masters, or GMs, or for game masters who are trying to run a new system. There is lots of advice out there for how to start running your own games, but I often find that there's no clear answer to the question, what do I run if it's my first time running this system? And with so many options available, I've often felt paralyzed by the sea of choices that are available to me online. If I search for advice online, I'll often find that there are folks picking out their favorite adventures, or folks that say I should homebrew my own adventure, or other folks still that say that the system that I want to run is dumb and that I should run a different system instead. That is the worst advice. I hate that advice. But close behind it is the unhelpful non-answer of you should run whatever works best for your table. Well, what I want to do in this video is I want to cut through the noise and give you some definitive recommendations about what you should run in any system in perpetuity. Run the starter set. I'm Pat, and this is my cat. I make videos that give practical advice to simplify your game and gamify the simple within your game. If that sounds good to you, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Okay, let's talk about the obvious reasons right away. The starter set is priced for beginners. That means that it is cheap. It is usually found online or in a big box store like Target for like 20 bucks. You can also buy it online pretty much anywhere games are sold for about the same price. They often include helpful materials that you might need to get started running the game, like dice, character sheets, punch-out tokens, and whatever else you might need to run. It will often teach you how to play in sidebars, like this adventure here, Lost Mind of Fendelver, which teaches you what an NPC is right alongside how to run the adventure. Like other pre-published adventures, running the starter set adventure means it's going to be less work of prep for you. Things are already done for you ahead of time. You don't have to think about the skeleton of plot, or NPCs, or fantastic locations. Lastly, starter set adventures are short in length, and they usually contain a quick start version of the rules, which makes them ideal for trying out the system without investing a lot of money. Okay, now let's talk about the less obvious reason about why the starter set is the best adventure to run as your first adventure for a system. It helps you understand the intent of the system's design and whether or not that system fulfills that intent. Okay, I'm gonna get a little down in the weeds here, but just stay with me, I promise it's worth it. Systems are developed to tell stories, and not all systems are good at telling all kinds of stories. Some systems come out and say right in the front of their book what you can expect, and for those games we can look to their starter set to determine whether or not it fulfills that expectation. For systems that do not telegraph their intent, we can look to the starter set to determine how the design expects you to play. This is important because it helps you decide whether or not it's worth investing time and money into the game. For instance, if you were reading a system about princesses intended to be played with kids, and the starter set provided an adventure that explained a lot of crunchy mechanics, that system doesn't sound like a good idea for you to play with your daughter over dress up and tea. Or if you had heard of Dungeons & Dragons and didn't know if 5th edition was right for you, thumbing through the free starter set adventure could help you make that decision. The starter set is the most clear and concise indication about how designers think you should use their system to tell your story. Generally, you can tell what an adventure and thus the system expects of you by playing through the adventure. As humans, we learn best through experience. But reading through the adventure can give you a lot of clues too. A good rule of thumb when reading through the adventure is that the more page space there is dedicated to a particular subject, the more likely it is that that's what the designers expect you to do. For example, if there's a lot of page space dedicated to an NPC, then it's pretty likely that the game expects you to interact with NPCs. If there's mechanics for how to socialize, it's pretty likely that the game expects you to socialize with NPCs. If the stat blocks for adversaries are long, the game likely expects combat to be highly tactical. And if the stat blocks are small, the game probably expects for combat to be short. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the super behemoth 80% market share of the tabletop role-playing game space. I don't know if that number is actually true. I know it's just something like that. 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons has been criticized by lots for wanting to be too broad, to appeal to too many people, and to tell too many different kinds of stories that it's not really equipped to tell. I think after reading through the Lost Mind of Phandelver, the starter set adventure for 5th edition, that 5th edition D&D wants to be a masterful DM storytelling toolkit, and that it wants players to resolve problems with adversaries through violent means. Lost Mine of Phandelver, or LMOP, includes about 1.5 pages of adventure background, detail about what the adventure expects players to do and where they will go. The adventure has a linear start, forcing players into the action, but includes some choices in the middle about where to go. Then, at the end, the plot converges back again in an epic fight to the death against the big bad evil guy. This is known as yam-shaped adventure design. I think I first heard that term coined by Mike Shea of Sly Flourish. Additionally, there is little advice given about how the world will react should the party ignore or fail to stop the threats of the big bad guys, beyond something that says, make it clear that the bad guys are causing even more trouble and that they need to be dealt with. That's it. As a system, 5th edition expects players to interact with the story that the DM has brought to the table. And officially published adventures like LMOP, Curse of Strahd, Storm King's Thunder, and Tomb of Annihilation all follow this same yam-shaped adventure design. To me, this is how I kind of see yam-shaped adventure design. And this is just for background only. If you are not interested in game theory or design, feel free to skip this. But yam-shaped adventure design comes in 3 different phases. The first phase, the adventure tries to force their characters into the action early and immerse the characters in the problems that the antagonistic force is pushing upon them. In the second phase, the adventure gives the characters an outlet for exploration and agency after the linear story in the first phase by presenting a broad option of locations to travel to, NPCs and plots to interact with, while progressing and interacting with that initial linear story from step 1. The third phase is when those choices affect the conclusion of the adventure, the final showdown with the main villain, and the final wrap-up in denouement. Okay. Let's talk about LMOP a little bit more specifically. Let's drill down into it. Minor spoilers ahead, but I'm going to try to do this in as spoiler light of a way as I can. The very first encounter of Lost Mine of Phandelver involves the players getting ambushed. The encounter gives this advice, quote, "This will likely be the first of many combat encounters in the adventure. Here are the steps you should take to run it effectively," end quote. And then it lists a 1/4 page of tactical recommendations and mechanics, such as how the enemies hide, how and when they move, and how they will hurt the party, and when they will run. In no piece of this encounter does it say the goblins can be reasoned with. There are a few encounters in this adventure that do give advice on how to talk to enemies or otherwise circumnavigate a battle, but they are the exception to the rule. I am not attacking 5e here. I personally think it is a strength of the system that the system knows what it wants to do. It wants to fight monsters. Anyway, social or exploration counters give far less tactical advice about how these monsters might react to the players trying to interact with them. Only 1 to 2 sentences at most. And this tells both the players and the GM that the system expects the players to solve most of the problems thrown at them through violence. 5e's intro adventure shows us that the system is a storytelling vehicle for the DM and that they are supposed to solve the problems that the DM throws at them through violence. The starter set for the OSR game Mausritter includes a very small adventure called Honey in the Rafters. Honey in the Rafters is a short 8 sentences long for the adventure background. And it is followed by 6 one-sentence story hooks to draw the players into the action. It's also written on only 3 whole panels of information here for this adventure. And this means that the GM is much more expected to rely upon the players for the narrative juice of the story. And there is no set expectation for how the story should go. No sequenced order of events, go here, go there, do this. Which means that the GM has to be ready for whatever the players throw at them, using the wants of the NPCs and the antagonists alongside the descriptions of the tiny locations in the tiny world to determine how that world reacts to the player's actions. Honey in the Rafters also includes no combat tactics for the enemies beyond the 3 short lines of their stat blocks. However, it does include a want underneath each enemy stat block. For example, the terrifying and silly Shig the Skunk wants to eat a decent meal and not be disturbed. The prominence of this creature's wants in the adventure signals for the game master that they should expect for players to try to solve problems with the enemies through powers of persuasion or duplicity, and that the GM should provide avenues for the players to do so. Mausritter's introductory adventure, Honey in the Rafters, shows us that the system doesn't focus on combat and relies on the players to drive the story forward. The Vaesen RPG has a proscribed story and wants players to solve problems with monsters through exploration. The starting adventure for Vaesen, a Nordic horror role-playing game, is called The Dance of Dreams. It is a mystery horror adventure centered around the player characters and their organization called the Society. The Dance of Dreams includes about 1.5 pages of introduction, which describes what happened before the player characters began and how the player characters are involved. This tells us that the player characters are expected to come into the story and participate alongside the adventure that is being prepared, but that the story is going to heavily involve them. One interesting section of the adventure is called Countdown and Catastrophe, which talks about how the world is reacting as the players go about the adventure. Bad things happen in this section, but these bad things present the characters with additional information. The text advises that catastrophe should progress, quote, step by step when something needs to happen. Do not rush it, and remember to let player characters act between events. This tells us that the system is expecting players to discover what is happening in the scenarios, yet despite success or failure, tension keeps ratcheting up while giving clues to what happens next. The stat blocks in A Dance of Dreams are large, about 1/2 page to 1.5 page long, depending on the importance of that monster. Yet, most of the information contained within that stat block is dedicated to things like the monster's wants, backstory, secrets, and other flavorful items. Combat statistics are small, only about 5 to 6 lines apiece. Instead, most of the adventure is about the mystery, which involves figuring out what the monster's weaknesses are. And according to the adventure, the system expects you to solve the problem through investigation. Finding clues, talking to NPCs, and discovering the root cause are at the heart of this system and of this adventure. Okay, so that's why I think that it's important to run the starter set to understand the intent of the design of the system and to understand whether or not, when that system is put into practice, if it meets the intent of their design. A little bit of troubleshooting here. If your system doesn't have a starter set, most systems do have an introductory adventure even if they don't have an actual starter set. In Vaesen, for example, there is no starter set, but that introductory adventure is contained within the pages of the core rulebook. If this advice doesn't apply to you, maybe it doesn't, if you're experienced with a system that you want to run games in. However, I think that this advice is also applicable to new campaign settings. Campaign settings often have introductory adventures tucked within their pages, and running them can be a look into the designer's mind of that campaign setting about how they expect adventures within their campaign to run. And for those of you who run a homebrewed system, thinking about what your introductory adventure would be like can help you answer some of the outstanding questions about your setting and give new players an inroad to your setting. That's it. That's the video. That's why I think that you should run the starter set for your first adventure in a new system or in a new campaign setting. Some reasons are obvious. The starter set is very high value. The intro adventure teaches you how to play inside its pages, and like other published adventures, it's a lot less work for you to prep. However, the other reason, and the one that I think is more important, is less obvious. Playing through the intro adventure helps you understand the intent of the system's design and whether or not the system fulfills the intent. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think. Does the starter sets that you've played through match the intent of the design for the systems that you've played? Let me know in the comments. Until then, roll those dice like they owe you some money.